I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts. Tell me this much. Does the mafia still exist today in, the significant cities, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia? Is it still actually there, or is it been completely wiped out?
Well, it's there, but it's greatly diminished. Whereas, I was speaking with George Anastasia, a longtime mob reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and he said, there used to be 80 guys and hundreds of associates, 80 made men and hundreds of associates, and now there's about 25, and he can count them. And as he noted, that if he can count them, so can the cops.
Yeah, and also, so can anybody who's looking to move in on their turf and their territory, younger, presumably more violent gangs. When you talk about them now, we just kind of think of those old black and white pictures. I'm sure there's younger guys and it's come down the generations, all right, but who is left and what are they kind of doing now? Let's take New York really as the big capital of what was the stronghold of the mafia.
Well, if you think of the mafia as, at one point, let's dial back the clock, as like a giant industrial sort of company. They had their hands in trucking, in unions, in manufacturing, along with the regular sort of vices like gambling and prostitution and drugs and that sort of thing. So it was this all-encompassing thing. Well, they've lost the labor unions. They don't have that, anymore. They've lost trucking by and large. So it's a much smaller mafia concentrated on smaller things. And because, they've also taken a hit because, gambling's been legalized, as has cannabis in many U.S. jurisdictions, and indeed in Canada as well. And we've seen just that they're just not the players they were. I mean, as Sammy the Bull Gravano, legendary mob hitman, former Gambino underboss, told me, he said, these guys don't even kill anymore.
I have to say, I loved your interview with him because, I actually, before I kind of realized that he was the ultimate snitch who became, as only in modern times this can happen, and really as only in America this can happen. He's become a kind of podcast star, So he's former mafioso. He gives up all his buddies, all the made men. He does the ultimate. He breaks omerta, and he lives, and then he becomes this podcast star. And you've interviewed him. I became interested in him because during those U.S. Senate hearings dating back, are they to the 70s or 80s? He gives evidence and he talks about boxing and how the US mafia, the New York mafia, saw boxing as a way to launder their money. And it echoed a lot for me with modern criminality, with the Kinahan organization. Were they doing similar? Is there ever an original idea as such? But tell me a little bit about him, because he's a fascinating character.
It's funny. Yeah, he is a very fascinating, very funny guy, extremely bright man. He was a guy who grew up in Brooklyn, and at that time, if you had trouble reading and things like that, you were automatically, considered by educators and teachers as stupid. Well, it was dyslexia, right? And in fact, he was a guy who probably, if he'd had that taken care of and had a few more advantages, would be running a Fortune 500 company. He was a guy, he was a devotee of the mafia. He fell into it, and he was a guy who was very, very low key. Barely anyone had heard of him, like outside that, the criminal underworld, until he was made underboss by John Gotti, underboss of the Gambino crime family. He was extremely successful. He controlled most of the concrete poured in New York City. He was, he looked at any time that, he had to kill, he looked at it as business. It wasn't something he took pleasure in. It wasn't, anything like that. And so what happened was he became Gotti's underboss. Now, we know now that John Gotti was a terrible mob boss. He was, blowing $200,000 a weekend on gambling on football and things. So he was a degenerate gambler. And so, of course, Sammy was a true believer. Now, he never would have, turned cooperating witness, as he prefers, to rat, canary, or stool pigeon, except that, the FBI got Gotti on tape, and he's saying, and Gotti's careless as hell, and the people around him are careless as hell. So we're saying, well, we'll stitch up Sammy. Sammy will take the fall on this, and that wasn't a meal that Sammy was going to take. And the feds played this for him, and he said okay, and he flipped, and sent Gotti and countless others to prison. But the interesting thing about that, Nicola, is that I said, when you were doing time, or were you ever really, were you looking over your shoulder? And initially, yes, but he said that messages were sent to him that a lot of other mob bosses and mobsters saw Gotti going to jail as a good thing, because he just drew so much heat, right? He's in the tabloids every day, flashing the $1 million pinky ring, and wearing bespoke suits and whatnot, and going out to nightclubs. And the model mob boss is somebody like the late Carlo Gambino, who's the nice old man who lives down the street and is very quiet and drives a modest car. That's your ideal mob boss.
So that's funny because, and really, I suppose, to understand the mafia and the evolution of it, it probably started with Al Capone in Chicago and with Prohibition. And there was opportunities there for smuggling. And of course, most of the mafia, you have to be Italian, I think, to be made a made man. You cannot be of any other origin. The mafia, they came from Sicily, where they had been born, up in the hills, where there was this code of honor. Omerta, you do not talk, you stick together. There was this blood bonds, and it was like them against the rest of America. And of course, by the time Vegas was built, and you had, the Chicago outfits, and you had the Philadelphia outfits, the New York outfits, they'd become really, really rich, wealthy, poured their money into concrete, as you say, built half of New York. But the likes of Gambino, you say he never had any connections and he wasn't known until he becomes this underboss. Is he just coming from the Italian community, or are these guys at his stage, you're talking really the 70s, are they second generation then in New York, or was Gambino and Gotti the first generation of the mafia there?
They're second generation, and I mean that's sort of second, maybe third. And that's sort of the problem that the mob has run into. Again, George Anastasia and I were talking about it, and it was that, previously, and I've found this from made men that I've interviewed over the years, and different things, is it was sort of a means for some of the old timers that came over and everything like that. It was a way of life. But as the years dial on and you're seeing the American dream in front of you, you're thinking, do I want my son to go into this and put a target on his back? No, you use your ill-gotten gains to send them to Harvard, to become a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer, right? So what happens is that the people going into it, increasingly, particularly now, are knuckleheads, and I mean,
So, in other words, the families and those five families of New York who ultimately went to war against one another, and ultimately the US authorities, the New York authorities, decided they'd become too powerful and they had to crack down on them. But they have almost, over the generations and moving forward to now, become gentrified almost.
No, that's quite right. Much like the late lamented Times Square of the 70s. They have become gentrified. They're more into, white collar crime. As Sammy said, they don't kill anymore. They don't have Vegas anymore. So they and gambling's legalized, but they're still into loan sharking and different things like that. And they're still into drugs as well, which, drugs were once forbidden because of the stiff penalties and that, anyone connected with you would face. So, a mob soldier starts selling heroin on the side. He gets pinched, and while, you had a coffee with Don Joseph on Thursday, so, ergo, you're part of this conspiracy, which, which are, of course, known in the US, which have been the backbreakers of the American underworld, has been the Rico laws, which Rico stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations. Now, Rico covers a wide spectrum of crimes and misdemeanors. So you can get ensnared in all sorts of things because from a shakedown, that can be multiplied into a criminal conspiracy, and the penalties are substantially higher. And the U.S. hadn't figured out how to use this law, which was enacted in 1970, until the early 1980s. And that has been, the game changer.
So that was brought in the 1970s, particularly to tackle the mafias and those five families of New York and elsewhere. We're concentrating largely on New York, but obviously there was very strong mafias in Vegas at one point, in Chicago, in Philadelphia, and I'm sure other parts of the US. But they were brought in to tackle them, and maybe like the gangland laws here, it took police a while to work out how to use them. So they started coming in and becoming very useful in the 1980s, early 1980s, when they started to break up those families. But ultimately, it seemed to me that along with those RICO laws, they did need somebody to flip. They did need those insiders. They do actually need mafias, gangs, criminal organizations to implode. And certainly that helps, I think, along the way.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, Joe Messina, who was head of the Bonanno family, I believe, in New York. I mean, you're getting, over the last, 20 years, you're getting mob bosses flipping, by and large to save themselves, of course, but the legislation's so tight and crime and punishment in the United States is, much more draconian than it is in Ireland or Canada. So, I mean, you're going away for a really, really long time. And, Don Vito's, 79 years old and in failing health. And they'll tell them, no, you're staying in. You're done. So, you're looking at that thinking, Jesus, I'm going to die in prison. And that makes a very compelling case to flip. There's not much honor in dying at 80 years of age in prison.
And absolutely can totally understand that. And that happens here as well, where there aren't such lengthy sentences. The idea of being put away for life or spending 3 decades in jail, isn't too attractive to many. But it's extraordinary that I think, and it's probably the only place in the world, maybe I'm wrong, but that they can break that omerta, break that sacred supposedly code, give evidence against others, spend their time in prison, but come out and become superstars. I mean, Gravano isn't the only one who's kind of
Well, Michael
used a
Francesi
celebrity.
as well. Michael
Yeah.
Francesi was head of the Colombo crime family. I've interviewed him as well. And it's funny. He recently wrote a book that is likening the U.S. government to the mafia. He's fairly outspoken about it. But he was a guy with a really good education, and he still ended up going into it. And he came up with the gas scam, and that was like $1 billion scam. From lifting gas from stations, gas that doesn't arrive or being shorted and then being resold. So, I mean, all these guys, it's like, and I think part of the thing is if it was once a quote unquote honored society and whatnot, it's no longer seen that way by everyone except the most starry-eyed wannabe gangsters. And I mean, Sammy told that to me too, because he was a true believer. I mean, he believed in omerta, he believed in the honor of it, and the sacred society and everything. And he came to see that was false.
But he still believes in the color of money, obviously, and is still making it. I mean, and he's sort of using that interesting past he has, and other people would find it offensive. Many do. And look, the man has admitted to horrendous crimes, but he's still making money essentially from that past.
Well, that's I guess gets back to my point earlier about this is a guy, a turn left here, a turn right there, and whatnot, and he's running a very large company, and yeah, I mean he's exploiting himself, but he does deliver. And you're right, it is a curious American thing that somebody like Sammy. I mean, he's a consultant on movies now and the TV programs, and he apparently has more women writing him than you can shake a stick at. So,
I might have to get him on here myself.
well, I can ask him if he wants to talk to you. I'm sure he would. He loves to chirp, right?
Wouldn't be my usual caliber, but interesting. And to go back, say, to concentrate on New York. So there are some families. I noticed that there was some charges brought against members of the Bonanno and the Genovese families, involved again in racketeering and money laundering charges brought against. So we're probably talking what, fifth, sixth generation of them now. So they're still somewhat active. They're not obviously big players on the scene, but they have been overtaken surely by these street gangs, by these biker gangs. What is there in New York, or is there just so many that there's no major big one concentrated gang?
It's splintered. I mean, a lot of, there's MS-13, which, the notoriously violent Central American street gang that's almost like a cult and has, almost elements of the mafia to it, but extremely violent. There's them, but they're not particularly good businessmen. There's the Crips. There's the Russian mob. There's I mean, it's a massive amount of it's a mosaic of criminal enterprise, and the mob is still a major player in New York. I mean, when I lived there, my neighborhood, in Astoria, was still a mob neighborhood, but it was also one of the neighborhoods that all through New York's very difficult times, when there were dozens of murders a week, that was a safe neighborhood. And that was known. You don't act up in those neighborhoods. But yeah, it's the crime world has splintered, And I think, I mean, like a lot of things, is that it's, moved more to, with the legalization of gambling and drugs, it's moved more to a lot of more white collar crimes, stock fraud, real estate scams, and that sort of thing. And, it's interesting that a guy I interviewed, John Binder, who wrote a book on the Chicago outfit. I mean, he says that his view is that the mob fails when it tries to compete with legitimate businesses, and that's the thing, is their two biggest streams of money have been essentially cut off by legal.
So, and that is very interesting for us, that the legalization of cannabis. So here, I think cannabis makes up, and certainly mostly in Europe, about 25% of the illegal drug trade. Cocaine, heroin, you have tablets, ecstasy, etc., making up the rest of it. But certainly cannabis is still actually one of the largest, like it and cocaine are possibly competing now. But legalizing that has taken, I mean, if we do sort of journalist maths, which is really basic, kind of, remedial.
Get the calculator.
Clearly, but if you took 25% of the illegal, the profits made from illegal drugs away from the drug market, where does that make an actual difference? Can you see a difference in that? Because you're presumably, and again, this is a little bit airy-fairy, but you're presumably saying that 25% of that money is going into legitimate society, it's been taxed, etc. It's been taken from the hands of the criminals. Does it make less of them, or does it make them more artistic in their endeavors?
Well, I like that turn of phrase, Nicola. But yeah, I think it does make them more artistic. I mean, look, growing up, I mean, no one, had pot, right? It was around and stuff like that, but now I've got people that give me bags of it. Oh, I grew it in my backyard here. I've got, and it sits in a drawer in my house, and like there's, I couldn't possibly smoke it all. I mean, I don't.
That sounds like my cooking apples coming into September, October, November that grow on the trees, and I'm trying to give them to people.
Yeah, well, no, and that's exactly. Oh, you got to test out these sort of thing, and so you multiply that across society. That takes a staggering amount of profit out of that. Now, and that was, the thing is about cannabis smuggling is, well, there's obviously, fewer penalties for that than say cocaine or heroin or pills, and so you've eliminated the profit motive. So they're moving more, which they always were in coke and heroin, but they have to answer to or deal with the Mexican cartels by and large, or the Colombian cartels, to to get the heroin and then put it out in the streets. And there's also that apparatus of getting drugs down to the street level, particularly hard drugs down to the street level, is significantly more difficult as well. And the places, they still sell in the clubs and all that sort of stuff, but you're way, way, way down the line, to the point where you're dealing with a quote unquote associate rather than a made person. And these guys are all living out in the suburbs as well. I mean,
is there a black market left in cannabis production? Because that would also be the fear, I think, in places in Europe, that if you legalize it. Now, cannabis, again, and you've pointed that out, it's something that somebody can grow in their garden, or if you have green fingers, you can work out how to put it into a glass house or how to cultivate it or whatever. We can't do that, obviously, with cocaine. We can't do that with heroin in our environments. But, like, is there still a black market in pot? Or did they literally, has it all settled down and have the kind of the criminals walked away from it?
There is, but it's real, at the low end of the scale. I mean, 2 blocks from my house, there's a cannabis dispensary. 2 blocks that way, there's a cannabis dispensary. 3 blocks that way, there's a cannabis dispensary. There's probably, I would say, within a 10-minute walk of my house, half a dozen cannabis dispensaries. So you're going to pop by to the nice clean cannabis dispensary and get what you need, or are you going to sit in an alley and buy drugs off some creepy guy named Otto?
Yeah, you've answered it there. And is it a little bit like going into a posh wine shop? Do you go in and you tell them like how stoned you want to get it or how, what flavors you want?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's it. I just want to sit and watch the Star Wars canon for 6 hours. Oh, here's what you want. You want this. I don't want to be falling down. Okay. But, and we have the edibles here. Where I grew up, I grew up on the edge of a native reservation. Now, they've at that particular Tyandanega, they've embraced the cannabis capitalism wholeheartedly, and it's a tiny place, and there's probably 60 dispensaries, within eyesight of each other, and people come from all over the province to go get their gummies or their weed there, and it's just all over the place. It's Smoking Joe's Cannabis, like all kinds of. It's like a massive economy. I don't know whether it's sustainable, whether there's that many people that want to get stoned, but it's very big. At least here in Canada right now.
Yeah, that's what I wonder. Will it sort of calm itself down a bit and will it just settle into the population? Like, not everybody wants to eat meat, not everybody wants to drink alcohol, not everybody wants whatever, tofu. Will it become because it's available? Is that the nature of humans? Not everybody kind of runs for it. I can only imagine if cannabis was legalized here in Ireland, we'd go completely and utterly bananas for probably about 2 years before we.
Well, I think it's funny. A friend of mine used to work at the Cadbury factory, one of the Cadbury factories in the UK, and they told them, look, you can eat as much chocolate as you want, and so after about 4 days, you never want to see it again. And I know guys that are like that that work in breweries that oh yeah, help yourself anytime, everything like that, right? And all of a sudden, the fridge is full because it's like no.
Can't look at it anymore. Gorge yourself on it. Anyway, we've slightly gone off. That is an extraordinary nirvana that seems over by you. But anyway, for many people here, I'm sure.
I'll show you around them when you get over.
Perfect. We'll just wander around and wander back out again, and but it's legal there. It's different. It's legal. Anyway, the mafia, they are they have been, I suppose, when you describe that sort of criminality, it seems to me that in the US, it's a lot more. You're probably further on than we are. A lot has probably happened because of the legalization of cannabis. You have a lot of different cultures there fighting for whatever it is they want. Those gangs, those street gangs you talk about, the Crips, etc., they sound in a much bigger way to some of our violent mobs here who just never make profits. Their actual primary function is violence. So behind the scenes, probably the mob have an experience, the mafias have an experience that many younger groupings would absolutely kill for because they are the most successful criminal outfit in the world. And when you think of where they came from and how quickly they became that, they almost created their own economy.
Well, yeah, it was, I think the Jewish mob boss Meyer Lansky, famously said, "We're bigger than General Motors," and certainly at that time that would have been true because they controlled all aspects of the economy. I mean, up till 25 years ago, 26 years ago, They controlled the trucking operations of the New York Post. And at the time they were stealing 50,000 papers a day because there's stuff in an envelope to the pressman and which is of course chaos on the paper itself. But like everything you can possibly think of, bakeries, and unions, right? Yeah, we got a problem. Well, we can shut you down in 5 minutes. I mean, that was the whole thing with the Teamsters, with the trucking, controlling Jimmy Hoffa and his successors was that, with the snap of a finger, you can shut down the American economy. That's how powerful they are. Now they can't do that anymore.
And is that why we're still so fascinated by them? We're still talking about them. I mean, you're doing your work still on the mafia, and in modern society, people are just still lapping up the stories of the mafia. There's still revelations coming out. We still don't know everything about them. They still have their secrets.
Well, the mob, the traditional organized crime, the mafia, it is a fascinating topic because it's not like, episodic TV. Okay, there's 45 minutes and it's over. It's like an overarching generational story that has not yet, we're in a little bit of the twilight. I think the mafia is always going to be there, but we're in a bit of the twilight. But you start looking at things now. Well, how did we get here to there? And you see the family connections, and this guy did that, and he thinked on so and so. And I mean, I also recently wrote about Philadelphia and Chicago, and these, in a lot of ways, they're the quintessential American stories. Everything we've come to know, who watch the United States, who've lived there, who've studied it, and that sort of stuff, is that the mafia is emblematic of the whole American ethos. That grab the opportunity by the throat, the American dream, except packing a gun. Nowadays, if you and I were to sit down and say, okay, Nicola, let's form our criminal enterprise, and the question is, are we going to do it with a computer or a gun? Well, that's a no-brainer, right? And that's something where they haven't jumped into, because part of the reason is, as I said, is the mafia gene pool is greatly diminished. Whereas, you could say 50, 60, 70 years ago that, these were men of vision. I mean, a criminal vision, granted, but the fixing of the fights, the point shaving on basketball games, and different things like that. I mean, they're very, ingenious scams, but they've had their day as well.
For sure. And I suppose finally, Brad, like, you talk about that, the American dream, and at the heart of that really is greed, whether we like it or not. It is that. And that's what drove the mafia. And drove them to kill, and drove them to, get involved with and muscle their way in on everywhere that there was money to be made. But like, where is the money? I mean, can you identify it now? Has it traveled down the generations? Is it within certain families? Has it been legitimized, and have generations and generations of, I suppose, Italian Americans benefited from that?
Oh, I think a lot of people have benefited from the mafia, particularly in the Italian American community, and that's not a stain on them. An immigrant to North America, it's can be a very hard go, and particularly to the United States, because it doesn't have the social safety net. So it's very cutthroat. So you have to do whatever you can to get a leg up, or you sink. And that's what it is. But ironically, it's, I don't want to be glib about this, given the violence and whatnot, but it is a great American success story. It's in a lot of ways, it's mission accomplished. Dad, was a loan shark and gambler and all this sort of stuff, and involved in myriad underworld schemes, right? Well, what's he do? He sends his son to, Harvard to become a lawyer, and that lawyer's kids are never going to get involved. I mean, here in Canada, a guy, unfortunately, he got murdered, but they had him on tape saying, he was the son of a mobster here, and he got asked, did he want to become a made member of the family? He's got on tape, God no, why would I want to do that? That's crazy. So that's the thing too, the smart kids have left.
Even in ordinary society, in legitimate society, or whatever you'd call it, I think the next generation looks on the one that went before them as aliens. I think we see that all the time with our own kids and with our own parents. I suppose things can change so vastly, and out of all that murder and mayhem, if some things have changed for the better, that's the least we can, I suppose, walk away with.
That's the silver lining inside the cloud, I think. I mean, it seemed things, but then there's John Gotti was quoted when he was sent to prison is that they're going to miss John Gotti, and there's an element of truth to that, just in that there was a level of organization and oversight on all these neighborhoods and criminal activities and things like that. I mean, there were certain things you didn't do. There was code, if you'll have it, or rules, and now there doesn't appear to be any rules. So you didn't hit a cop, you didn't hit a journalist, you shut up, but that's all gone. That's a lost world.
Despite the presence of that vast Atlantic Ocean between our nation and yours, it sounds as if things are pretty much the same no matter where you are. So, Brad Hunter, thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicola. You take care of yourself.